This is a special unholy update. 3 Israeli hostages, Romi Gonen, Emily Damari, and Doron Steinbrecher, are home after 471 days. It's the first day of the first stage of the second hostage deal. And it was a good day, Jonathan.
Yeah, I mean, watching it from afar, although in the case of Emily Damari, not so far, because she is, a British Israeli, so the British media and British Jewish community were incredibly engaged by her case. Football fans just the other day were chanting, she's one of our own, just days before her release. So, the emotion of this event has rippled all around the world. But just give us, I mean, obviously you were sitting in the anchor's chair for a marathon 12 hours, so you have a very particular vantage point. But just how that has been emotionally for the country and where you're sitting.
I mean, first of all, it was a good day of joy and of relief. When we talked last time, I thought it's a moment of grace. And the one thing that we were worried about, concerned, is how they will be coming home. Because we knew, obviously, the sadism of these people. We saw it on October 7th. We knew what the people who had returned in the first hostage deal back in November, December of 2023 said about the way they were held. We knew, how the hostages that were found dead in the way that they were found. So we were the Israeli public, if there was something that they were concerned, and kind of everyone was, if this is a Jewish podcast, I can say everyone was on Shpilkes yesterday, right? Because we were all kind of tense and waiting to see how they would be coming home in that moment. These things always take a long time. We saw the sort of convoys of the Red Cross, and we could report that they were handed over from Hamas to the Red Cross. Everyone saw these pictures, right, of the Hamas Nukhba armed. Actually, there were hundreds of them in the city of Gaza and surrounded by a crowd, and how in really seconds, in this frenzied moment, suddenly they were transferred from Hamas to the Red Cross. And the one thing I was looking for is to see if they were walking on 2 feet. That would give you an indication of just what their physical state was before anything else. And the first thing we saw was that they were indeed walking on their 2 feet. And so when that happened, I think there was this huge collective sigh of relief you could hear all over the country. And just these, through this very long broadcast, these moments of joy when you speak to Romi Gonen's grandmother, Dvora, and she's, saying, I was staying alive just for this moment. Or a moment when Emily Damari's friends were dancing around, actually picking up our correspondent, Lee Naim, putting her on one of their shoulders and dancing around with her, because people were suddenly so elated. Just this kind of moment of pure happiness. There weren't a lot of these moments over a year and 3 months, and we talked about this. The spontaneous eruptions of joy happened around this moment where Israel, can hug the people who were hostages for such a long time.
I mean, partly because of what you and Amos Harel said on our last episode, I think on Friday or Thursday. The days are merging a bit, but I was braced for scenes that weren't like this. That, for one thing, I thought everything would be off camera, and I was bracing for, wheelchairs, stretchers, ambulances. I didn't know what we were going to expect, and I thought it would all happen off camera. And as you say, instead we saw 3, able-bodied young women able to move on their own 2 feet. And Mandy Damari, mother of Emily, has said that her daughter's medical condition is much better than expected in a statement that she's released. And so, you're talking about Jewish reaction. So now you worry, is that because they're the first 3 and that they wanted the first 3 perhaps the ones who are fittest? I don't know. But that was a great relief. And to see these 3 young women sort of smiling and hugging, I thought we were going to have to wait several days for those images. And instead they came straight away. I mean, something about the scene that you described of these sort of Hamas men surrounding the vehicle. I mean, for one thing, how frightening that must have been, just that moment of transfer one to the other.
By the way, every single hostage came out, said that was the most frightening moment of their entire time in captivity, was that moment where people surrounded the car, and it actually it traumatized them. Some of them asked us as a television channel not to have those voices or those images on again because it traumatized them so much. That exact moment that is so dangerous and so perilous when they
Yes.
move from one to the other. And by the way, the people who are defending you are the people who held you captive 5 minutes ago. So, and it's not that they care about you so much, but they care about that the hostages as an asset. So it's a very scary moment.
It's very interesting to hear you say that, because that was my impression watching it. It looked like a terrifying thing, just this huge crowd and vehicles being shaken and so on. But also, I mean, unless it's too soon to talk about this, I just thought the power of that image from Hamas's point of view and why they wanted that image, because they clearly did. It was stage managed. In fact, photographs have been circulating today, one day on, showing where the sort of camera zooms further out and you see it's actually in some ways quite artificial, that it was a big crowd around the vehicles, but there wasn't much of a crowd beyond that. In other words, they'd got everybody they had to there. They dressed them up very much in that sort of military garb and masked and so on. It was a very intimidating image. It struck me that they were sending a message, which is, Hamas, we are still here, that this is something that we are doing from strength, not weakness, that this is, as they see it, a victory, that they've managed to push Israel into this deal. And I wondered how Israelis, and I want to hear from you, how Israelis reacted to this image, because on the one hand, you could look at it and say, well, Hamas is still there. The job has clearly not been done. But Netanyahu said to us, we are going to destroy, annihilate, total victory, whichever phrase you use, all of Hamas, and yet there they still are with weapons, Kalashnikovs firing to the end, so on, or aimed at the sky. That's a very potent image. Or whether that's one view. The sort of Betzalel Smotrich view would be, right, we've got to keep going and keep hitting these people. And then there was this other view, which is in some ways articulated by the outgoing Biden administration, which was their fear that the last 15 months have recruited as many Hamas fighters as have been killed. And look, here's the visual proof. And therefore, you've got to do some other way. That military means isn't going to eradicate this threat. That's a whole lot going on in one image. But I wondered of what the, beyond just the emotional reaction, seeing the young women returned, what reaction there is to seeing Hamas there in force, in numbers, dressed to intimidate.
I mean, so I would just dive into that, to those images a little bit more. And not only were they, walking on their 2 feet, none of us could even begin to imagine what they went through mentally, right? But physically, the hospital said immediately that the doctors were quite surprised of looking at their physical situation. They said they can focus on being with their families. We'll focus on their health from tomorrow, but now we want to give them the time. You see, that image of Merav Leshem Gonen, Romi's mother, who in this country has become one of the fiercest warriors for this hostage deal, really a symbol. And these are people who this was thrust upon them, right? They didn't ask to become these heroes of anything. And she was, cradling her daughter in this image that I assume went on all over the world. And you're saying she's a 24-year-old young woman, but for her mother, she is her baby, right? And she's cradling her after fighting for 471 days. You see Emily Damari, who was injured while taken into captivity, doing her own version of a victory sign, right? Without her fingers, but still our correspondent Elad Simchayev wrote on Twitter, he said, don't mess with Israeli women. I mean, I have to say I relate to that a little bit. And, and you see that in Doron Steinbrecher, who, her father, we used to say about him that he had the saddest eyes because he was just waiting for his daughter and finally reunited with her. We should say, by the way, that Emily and Doron come from Kfar Aza. Kfar Aza is a kibbutz that was devastated by October 7th. 64 of its members were murdered. 19 were abducted. Every kibbutz in Israel, most kibbutzim have this sort of the young neighborhood of the people who are the second generation or third generation. So their particular neighborhood was hurt very, very badly by this. So them having this kibbutz being so happy, by the way, they're of course not in Kfar Aza, they're in different places around Israel. But it was really, I can't say this enough, a moment of relief for the country who really desperately needed this, I think. And it's an indication there are people alive. Their families are waiting for people who are alive, still dozens of them. And I think the urgency of that became very, very clear as these young women came home.
And do you think the emotion of that, for the sense that this is not just a sort of, it never was abstract because of the parents and the families and the friends who campaigned day after day after day, but there were people who were sort of wondering what fate, what state the hostages will still be in. The fact that we have seen 3 living, breathing, walking on 2 feet human beings means that the pressure to make sure the other ones now do come back, that develops its own kind of momentum now, a different kind of momentum from 48 hours before.
I think so, but we have to remember that this is a very, very rocky deal, and that we will, out of the 33 that are supposed to come home from this first stage of the deal, there are still 64 in the second stage, most of them are alive, but not all of them. So we will see, and the next hostage phase happens on Saturday, and under the agreement, it still needs to be 4 living women. It's gruesome that this is what is said, but it is actually the wording in the agreement. After that, we will begin to see something different, and people coming home that aren't alive. I mean, bodies that are coming home. So it will be a very mixed bag of emotions. I think it does give, that was my feeling, that it does give the urgency. And it does say, listen, these people really are alive and really can come back to their families. It was proven yesterday. So I think that is the answer to what you asked.
Yeah, and the reason partly I raise it is because of, the pressure to make sure that this deal is fully implemented and goes through, first of all, this 42-day period with these periodic releases, mainly in groups of 3, sometimes 4, over the next now 41 days, to make sure that happens, that there's no backsliding, certainly from, what it can be in Israel's control. Obviously, you can't control what Hamas do on the other side. That then there are serious negotiations for the second side. I mention that partly because there has been some reporting even today that Prime Minister Netanyahu is signalling to some of his reluctant coalition partners that, look, don't worry, I'm not going to do the second deal, and that we will go back, second phase of the deal rather, because we will go back to fighting. And those are the terms on which one minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir, quit the government just yesterday. He said he would, and he did. But also Bezalel Smotrich, the other far-right minister, has said he will if Israel does go ahead with the next stage and refuses to renew the fighting. So I'm just wondering if the public feeling, the emotion you're describing, where you've now seen in just, in concrete human terms, a mother cradling her returned daughter, whether that pressure will become sort of irresistible. It was pretty strong before, but now it becomes an extra level of irresistible and becomes impossible for the Prime Minister not to go ahead with this next stage and the next stage and the stage after that.
This is the main question now. Does this deal continue? And it should lead to the end of the war, because that is what the agreement says after the 3 stages. And you're right about what has been reported here of what Netanyahu said to Smotrich. And remember, Ben-Gvir quit, Smotrich didn't. He voted against the deal. By the way, just in parentheses, this did not prevent him from yesterday tweeting that he's so happy that Romi and Doron and Emily are home. Some would perhaps say that he should be the chutzpah award nominee of this week. But he voted against the deal and stayed in the government. So what Netanyahu said publicly was, if we can't achieve the goals of the war, we will go back to the war, which is quite vague and does give you this cover to say, well, we said we'll crush Hamas and Hamas isn't crushed. Let's return to the war. It has been reported that to Smotrich himself, he has said something more clear about his intentions to return to this war before the second stage. That's going to have its problems, because he promised not only the outgoing President Biden, but the incoming President Trump, that this is the deal, and he signed it. So this is going to be a major question. I think let's remember who started the war and attacked Israel, Hamas. I think they want to continue the deal because that will promise the end of the war. So to them, and that's what they want. So it is a question whether this continues, and it is a question whether the Israeli public, the pressure will be mounting. I think it will. But again, it's a question of what the next couple of weeks, so we have 5 weeks for this first stage to continue, what that would look like.
Yeah, I mean, the first report that I read on this morning, and I just mentioned this because of who wrote it, but the headline was, Netanyahu is lying to Trump and preparing to sabotage the Gaza ceasefire deal. That was by Amir Tibon, who was himself a victim on October the 7th. He and his family were hiding under fire on their kibbutz in Nahal Oz, and therefore he sort of knows whereof he speaks. And so he there writing this idea that, as you mentioned, that two different versions are being told, one to Trump, I'm going to keep the deal, the other to Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, don't worry, I'm going to break it. I think this will be a big and early test. As you and I speak, it's hours before Donald Trump swears the oath of office to become the 47th president of the United States. I think this is going to be one of his very early tests, because Netanyahu he will either betray Donald Trump and his promise to keep this deal, or he'll betray those far-right coalition partners. He can't keep his promises to both. And does Donald Trump give the energy and sort of effort to make sure that this deal is fully stuck with and implemented? Or does he then have other things he's got to do? A little part of me does think that Donald Trump was at the maximum point of political power before taking office. It's the days and weeks that led up to this deal, which led to those amazing scenes that, we've been talking about. Then he could threaten. He could say, you don't want to see what I'll do if I'm in office and this deal hasn't come in. Once he's in office, in a way, there's less of that threat, because by then it's, well, what do you actually do? It's, the monster is scarier when you can't see the monster, as it were. So I think that's a big political question. I want to just go back to those images that we saw and that we talked about, that the released hostages said themselves were in some ways among the most frightening experiences of their whole time in captivity. It seemed to me those images were very, very deliberate on the part of Hamas. There's been some photographs and footage that's come out today showing the sort of camera, as it were, zooming out and showing you that those crowds were just around the vehicles and really pretty well empty space all around. In other words, they stage managed a photo op in which it would look like hordes and hordes and hordes of Hamas fighters, Hamas men around these women. It's slightly, the optics of that was slightly, managed. But nevertheless, that would have looked, that was a very deliberate message being sent, which is we're still here. We're not beaten. We're not defeated. There are still men with guns, with uniforms, Kalashnikovs. They are still a threat. And I'd be very interested to hear from you how Israelis reacted to seeing that, because there could be one gut reaction which just says, so we haven't eradicated them. Netanyahu promised that it was going to be total victory, annihilation, Hamas would be gone. They're not gone. We can see them on our screens. And therefore, you could then take the conclusion of the Smotrich and Ben-Gvir position, which is we've got to resume fighting. Or the other view, I'm sure there's fewer people who take this position, but it was the one voiced by the outgoing Biden administration, which did say with a heavy heart they feared that more Hamas men have been recruited in the period since October 7th than Israel had removed by military action. And that this image, in a way, could say, well, look, however many we've killed, more have replaced them. So I'm just wondering how Israelis reacted to that image, besides obviously the emotional and joyous reaction seeing the women return, seeing Hamas men, guns aloft, still present, still there.
Yeah, I mean, look, it wasn't an easy image for Israel or whoever cares about Israel, because this is after a year and 3 months. 840 soldiers died in Gaza actually on October 7th and since. And this is a very, very tough and the longest, most complicated war Israel waged. And if after all that, what you see is this power, and of course it was, as you said, staged, but Hamas still has the power to stage this. That is just on a sort of gut level, emotional level, that is not an easy thing to see. I spoke to a few top officers in the military, and what they say is, yes, Hamas is much weaker than it was. It's still the strongest entity in Gaza, and as long as there isn't an alternative to Hamas, this is what we will continue to see. So that is something to consider if you want to be the Bezalel Smotrich and the Ben-Gvir and saying, okay, this shows you that you need to continue the war. Whoever thinks that will still think that after seeing it. I think a lot of other people will say, well, this is proof that you need, obviously, something else. But just on the emotional level, it wasn't easy to see. By the way, another thing that really isn't easy for Israelis is the fact that this deal will see the release of hundreds of terrorists. And when you go through the list of what they perpetrated 2 Israelis, hundreds of Israelis died because of these people. It's just a list of all of the terror attacks that Israel suffered over the 90s and in the Second Intifada and since. It's a very difficult thing. And when Yair Sherki was our correspondent. We mentioned him. We gave him a Mensch Award a few months ago in a different context. His brother was killed in a terror attack, and the person who did that will be released. And he said, this is painful for me, but Romi Gonen is alive. And my brother is not coming back. But this is also a dilemma that Israelis are wrestling with when they see this deal. It's a difficult deal to swallow, but it is bringing back Israelis alive, and their clock is running out. That is, I think, the most important thing to look at.
Yeah, and we talked about this, didn't we, with Amos last week, about how the fear will be that there are prisoners being released who not only have done things in the past, but may go on to do terrorist actions in the future. And one remembers that Yahya Sinwar was one of those released in just such an exchange. You just say about difficult images for Israelis to see. I'm not sure how much Israelis should expose themselves to international media coverage. They would find one aspect of that, the bit we've just talked about, difficult, partly just because the language that's been used, I've spotted, has been that they're saying, we're with the Israeli families who are waiting for their loved ones to be released, and now going live to a correspondent with the Palestinian families waiting for their loved ones to be released, and very much treating the two things as if they're equivalent. And I noticed one person on the BBC sort of saying about Palestinians and their prisoners, as if Israel was waiting for their prisoners, and it's somehow equivalent. And occasionally you see the language of hostage swap, as if those Palestinians detained are hostages rather than people who, not in every case we should say, but in most cases have gone through a process and been convicted of crimes. There are some who are detained without charge, but I think Israelis in this current mode would probably better be steering clear of some of the international coverage, which has been sort of tempted to treat it as if these two things are identical.
All this is ruining my happy day, Jonathan. Don't ruin my happy day.
I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that.
But we do need to say, I can't think of any example of this kind of complicated deal of civilians being held for such a long time in torturous conditions in the West, right? I'm not talking about other parts of the globe. There is no, I remember Hadass Calderon, whose 2 children came back from captivity, Sahar and Erez, in the first deal, and her ex-husband, their father, is still in captivity. He's supposed to come back in this deal. Ofer Calderon, she said, I wanted to read, how to help them, some sort of material on how to mentally help them, how to physically help them. There's nothing about this kind of prolonged situation, captivity for civilians in the world. It is such, and there's different ages, there's different, it's just a very, very intense time. And as we said, they came back, they're on their feet, they're with their families, it's very happy. We don't know what kind of hell they went through and how they will process this. We do know that everyone who came back and was there 50 days said they left Gaza and the captivity in Gaza, but it never left them. So that's also something to consider.
That's a really important point to make as well, is that last time in the November and December 2023 releases, there were a lot of people, I remember particularly on social media, who sort of thought that the first image told you everything you need to know. Look, they're fine. They haven't been mistreated at all. It's all propaganda. I remember that was being said a lot, which is it's so facile. And obviously there are wonderful first day images and people are celebrating those rightly, but the scars will be, many of them, beneath the surface, and it's that psychological toll that those families will be dealing with and those individuals will be dealing with for many, many years to come. So I think anyone who's sort of latching on to just a quick image shared on Instagram and deciding that's the whole story, that's probably a mistake.
That's definitely true. They have a long journey, but at least they're home. These are young women. Romi is 24, Emily is 28, Doron is 31. Their whole life spread, before them, and they can, I hope, continue it from that moment that it froze. Just think of you and I, all of the things that we did since October 7th, and that their life has completely frozen. What that means, I think it means, and you said, what does this, when the nation is looking, does it sort of underscore the urgency of this deal or not? I think it reminds us that we are this nation, that we are the nation that was hit badly, terrible failure. We had some successes on the battlefield for sure, but this moment, and that's why it felt so important yesterday, that defines who we are. And we are that nation that says, no, we will pay a high price, but we will bring back our sons and our daughters and our brothers and our sisters who were taken, who are innocent people who were just taken from their house or a party or anything else, and we'll bring them back. And I think that is why that moment yesterday, and more than a moment, a few hours actually, that meant so much, that we're actually historic in a way.
Very, very heartening to see it. We'll be talking about it all and much more when you and I get together again for our regular episode. But our all our good wishes go to those families and to all the families still waiting. We'll see you next time.